A shining city on a hill best describes the Acropolis in Athens. And one of the best views of it is from the Areopagus. The name means Rock of Ares, but after the Roman conquest, the name of the Roman god was substituted instead, and so it's now renamed Mars Hill. And when you walk down from this glorious pile of buildings that make up the Acropolis, including the Parthenon, whose parched bones are softened red poppies, spring up amidst the fallen capitals, you come to this large outcropping of rock. And the original stairs that are there are worn so terribly that they're really rather dangerous to climb these days. But people do every day. People climb them. And the hill leads to an edge where one could tumble down if not careful towards the Agora in the distance and the Temple of Zeus even further on. And legend says that this was the rock where Ares was tried by the gods for the killing of Poseidon's son. It looks white there, but it's really quite red when you're standing on it. It's the site of Aeschylus' tale of the trial of Orestes for the killing of Clytemnestra. It is also the very real place of the trial of Socrates for his unusual religious and political views, and of his own subsequent death by drinking hemlock. A lot went on up on that rock, I guess is the long and short of it. And some 500 years later, it was the place where these philosophers and statesmen came together to debate, and it still functioned that way in Roman times as well. It was from this location, drawing from the potential significance of the Athenian altar to the unknown God, that Paul, the Apostle Paul, is said to have delivered this famous speech. Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live by temples built by human hands. And this, in perhaps the only place in the scriptures, Paul explicitly quotes Greek philosophy to describe God's nature as one in the place we live and move and have our being. So Paul was also challenging the Athenians there about this expansive nature of God, and I think that's what we've been doing ever since, finding God becomes larger and larger and larger. The concept, for us to be able to describe it, seems difficult. In fact, online with some friends from 10 years ago celebrating the graduation of having a D-Min, came up the idea of what is a D-Min? D-Min is a doctor of ministry, but it used to be called something else. It used to be called a doctor of divinity. And it was changed because we realized that the idea of getting a doctorate and understanding God is completely fallacious. Right? And so instead it got changed to being, what can we do as ministers to better our craft and callings? So, he made his way up Mars Hill, this Apostle Paul. He went past streets where, as in places like Ephesus, there were artisan shops there that sold household gods. They got in their shop in the morning with some clay and they churned out some gods for people. And so I brought some household gods with me today, and I'm going to pass them around. And don't feel you have to be careful just because they're 2,000 years old. I trust you all. So I'm going to start, I don't know what I did before. What do you remember? Which one was that? This is Horace. And Jody, I'll start you with part 5. These gods were once kept in shrines, and they were kept in household shrines well over 2,000 years ago, and they were worshipped by families that were now long gone. So this one is Horus. Is this Horus? We go back a slide. This is Horus. Horus has a giant lock of hair on the right side of his head. Later on, he'll become a falcon. It happens in Egyptian mythology. And the story goes like this. The goddess Isis' brother Set killed her husband Osiris, cut him into many pieces, and threw his reproductive organs into the Nile, where a catfish ate them. Put them on a barge on the river with her, and from that, Horus was born. What family doesn't have its apocryphal stories? Next slide. This is Harpocrates. He's the grown-up Ptolemaic Greek version of Horus, and he holds his finger up to his nose. He represents secrecy and silence, and he was one of the most popular, commonly collected family household gods. What does that say? And so at the beginning of our passage from Acts, Paul is waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens. And as Paul waits in the public square of the city, he's disturbed by all of these household gods that are being sold all around him. He begins conversations about this, first in the synagogue and then in the marketplace with these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And in the course of all of these dialogues, he begins to talk about a theology that was much different than what was expected as religion in its day, as we do, I think, today as well. And as Socrates got himself into trouble centuries before on account of a similar charge and was brought to a trial at Mars Hill, so did Paul face the same charge and got taken to the same place for trial by his critics. But Paul helped us all move the faith path down the road. Rob Bell, he is an evangelical with the hottest and biggest and newest church a few years ago. It was appropriately named the Mars Hill Church. And he wrote this book called Love Wins, a book about heaven, hell, and the fate of every person who ever lived. So he must have known his topic pretty well. It's a hopeful and an inspiring message that articulates how we today are to walk this walk of Jesus. During an art show at his church, there was a picture of Gandhi on the wall with a little quote by Gandhi next to it. And a visitor to the exhibit stuck a note next to the Gandhi quotation that read, "Reality check, Gandhi's in hell." And that is what started Rob Bell on a change in his theology and in writing the book. He was shocked, and this begins his book. He writes, "Really? Gandhi's in hell? He is? We have confirmation of this? Somebody knows this without a doubt? And that somebody decided to take the responsibility of letting the rest of us know this?" That Bell, an evangelical, would question the existence of hell and the possibility of salvation for everyone brought down the wrath of pastors, denominations, and Christian circles closest to this evangelical pastor for saying many of the same things that we have been saying for decades. And though no hemlock had been offered for Bell to quaff, he became anathema to the evangelical and theological circles that he worked in, while at the same time his brave move has been made to question long-held beliefs through confronting his own like-minded Christian set. If not only just his own church, he's shown a fresh spirit in a dry theology of unquestioned certainty. The Southern Baptist leader Moeller said, "When you adopt universalism and erase the distinction between the church and the world, then you don't need the church, you don't need Christ, you don't need the cross. This is the tragedy of non-judgmental mainline Christian liberalism." And it's Rob Bell's tragedy in this book as well. See, what's been happening, and it's been happening for decades, is there's a shift going on in our theology, and it's happening so, well, actually rapidly, but for us so slowly. We don't really know what or where it's going. But in Bell's shift in theology, and I think in our mainline theology, it's what we do to help each other. It's what we do together to help each other on this walk once we decide that we are followers of Jesus. Not the who's who of who's in and who's out, that's been based on prejudices or misconceived notion about others and the self-importance born of concern from within a major part of America's church community, is Bell's Christianity, our Christianity, less judgmental, more fluid, open to questioning the most ancient of assumptions? Is that on an inexorable rise? Do we feel that happening? Because we know Bell has helped move us down the path as well. And the most helpful note in the article is Bell's response to all of this, given his community. He says, "I have long wondered if there's a massive shift coming in what it means to be a Christian. Something new is in the air." And so on this day, when all of the churches are starting to talk about what the Spirit means, the Spirit that's being sent forth to them, it is the spirit of being open to a more expansive understanding of our own interconnectedness one to another, equal access, an inclusive vision of the realm of God. That's what's so hopeful and helpful. Whether it's Paul challenging the Athenians on Mars Hill in Athens, or if it's Rob Bell challenging a Christian community that has written off progressive Christians like ourselves in his own Mars Hill, if we really believe it to be true that that which we name as God is the source of love, and if it's the source of the ground of all being with us, then slowly, slowly, hearts will be turned. The tie to our passage on the real Mars Hill moves seamlessly into this passage from John, and we're here, this advocate is coming. Who is this advocate coming to become a part of our own churches and wrestle with what we really do believe to be true? Years ago, preacher Barbara Lundblad, a wonderful Lutheran preacher at Union Seminary, said, "I read something rather odd." She says, this is what the quote said: "The reason mountain climbers are tied together is to keep the sane ones from going home." When things get tough up there on the mountain, when fear sets in, when a climber is tempted to say, "This is crazy, I'm going home," the life of faith can be like that. The doubts set in, despair overwhelms us. The whole notion of believing in God seems just crazy. And Jesus knew his disciples would have days like that. So he told them, we're all tied together like branches on a vine, or like climbers tied together by a rope. We're tied by the Spirit one to another to trust in one who is always more than we can understand, to keep us moving ahead on some journey of faith, to encourage us when believing seems absurd. "I will not leave you orphaned," said Jesus in this passage. "I am coming to you." This community here in Irvine is important. This is important, what we do here together. We are trying to move forward an inclusive message of Christianity. Can I get an amen on that? Amen. It is important what we do so that we can bring more folks into a more inclusive understanding. I hope visitors, if you're here today, you're welcome to come to our meeting afterwards. We're going to be talking about expanding our building a little bit. We're going to be talking about becoming a creation justice church. You, this community, are important. One of the famous blues musicians of the 50s and the 60s was this great blues master, Jimmy Reed. Reed was a sharecropper's son, and he brought this throbbing harmonica and guitar-driven black rhythm and blues of the Mississippi Delta up into the popular rock and roll mainstream. And there's this interesting story behind the old vinyl Jimmy Reed albums. I tend to think we're very low in how many people has an old vinyl Jimmy Reed album at home, but if you play a Jimmy Reed album, and if you put the needle on the groove, and if you listen very carefully for a little while, in the background you will start to hear a woman's voice, a soft voice, murmuring in advance the next verse of the song. And the story that grew up around this was that Jimmy Reed was so absorbed in the beat and the guitar riffs of his music that he simply could not remember the lyrics of his own songs. He needed help with the lyrics, and the woman's voice was none other than that of his wife, devotedly coaching her husband through the recording session by whispering the upcoming stanzas in his ear as he sang. Whatever we think of this story being true or not, it's a parallel to today's text. Jesus tells his followers that the role of the Spirit is, in effect, to whisper the lyrics of the gospel themes into the ears of the faithful. Love God, love neighbor as yourself. Love God, love neighbor as yourself. And here's the story that will play out this year and the next year and the next year as we hear that story, that gospel story brought out in Spirit-led ways, and we hear love God, love neighbor as yourself. When Jesus was present, he was the one who healed and taught and coached them through the proper verses, and he taught these commandments. But now that he is leaving, he hands it over to a Spirit presence, is what is being said in the passage from John anyway. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And next is the Spirit of truth. Socrates spoke these words of truth that angered those who knew him, and Paul escaped with his life on more than one occasion, including his experience on Mars Hill in today's readings. And now something new is slowly changing us here in the church and in the culture. And there's a massive shift coming in what it means to be Christian. And that something new is in the air, and it's being expressed by many different voices. Bill Allenbach has expressed it eloquently in his own book. Paul might add to that the words he spoke to the Athenians when he talked about a God that could not be contained by any description made by human hands. That which we will ultimately know to be true, that the Spirit of truth will eventually lead us there. And it's not now ours now or ever to try and create or contain or restrict our growing understanding of what makes us, you and me, spiritual beings, reacting with one another, in community with one another and with this world, and called to follow this great commandment, to give back the love that has been given to us, and the love for one another, the love for that ground of all being. Amen. Amen. Let's rise and sing our closing Alleluia.